Welcome to the Paranormal AF podcast. I'm your host, Rin, and I thought it would be an interesting discussion to have. Would you wear jewelry or some other item that was made out of human remains? Now, here is what sort of led me down this path of contemplating this. Some of you may remember that a little while back there was a woman in Salem, Massachusetts that got arrested for selling human remains. From what I've been able to gather, she owned this little curio shop where she sold all sorts of creepy macabre stuff, which is right up my alley. You know, from what I've heard about her store, if I were to have visited Salem, I probably would have stopped by there because she was supposed to have some really cool stuff. And when she was first arrested, a lot of people, I heard them speaking on TikTok and things like that, saying, oh, they believed it was all a misunderstanding and that, it would all get cleared up. She really wasn't the one in the wrong. But it turns out down the road that it looks like she was knowingly dealing in human remains that had been illegally obtained. So now some of you may wonder, is it even legal, or how is it even legal to deal in human remains? And the answer is that apparently there are certain ways that you can buy and sell human remains in certain places within the United States. Now, it very much is a gray area, and there are people who function within the law, which in a lot of places isn't too specific, but they manage to find ways to do it legally, or as legally as one can. But I wanted to read this passage. This is from a Spectrum News New York article that was written on this case because the woman in Salem was actually getting these human remains from someone who was stealing them from Harvard Medical School. And that is how they all got arrested. From what I've been able to read, it wasn't really that they were buying and selling the human remains. It was that the remains were illegally obtained because the man at Harvard Medical School and his wife were stealing the human remains from there and then selling them. And according to this article anyhow, and she has not been tried of this crime yet, so I guess I should say allegedly she knowingly was receiving stolen property from this couple. So that seems to be, from what I have read, and I have not done a deep dive into this, that seems to be what the actual charges are for. But in that article, they have this little paragraph, and I'm going to read this word for word from the Spectrum News article, just because I don't know what all the laws are regarding this topic, and I just wanted to throw this out there before we dive into what I actually wanted to talk about. But per this article, there are no federal criminal statutes that deal with the mishandling or sale of human remains, and in most states, the sale of human remains is not illegal, said Tanya D. Marsh, a Wake Forest University law professor who has written books about cemetery and human remains law. Marsh said there is a widespread market for human remains, and it's not expressly legal, but in most states, it's not expressly illegal either. She calls it a gray market. There are laws in many states against grave robbing, but the vast majority of states don't have any law that has to do with human remains that haven't yet been buried, Marsh said. So my takeaway from this little paragraph is that it's not the possession, sale, etc. of human remains that is necessarily illegal in the United States. It's how the remains are procured that would actually catch you the charges. Like in this case, where the man and his wife were stealing human remains from Harvard Medical School. So legal issues aside, I was perusing Facebook the other day, and there was a post in the oddities group one of the oddities groups that I belong to. But this person was selling rings made out of human femurs. Now, I understand the desire and attraction to the macabre, and would I wear like resin or ceramic jewelry that looked like human remains? Maybe. There's a time and place. But would I wear real human remains? And then, after I saw that post of the rings made out of human femur, someone else in the oddities group was selling what they said was a Victorian specimen that was a human finger, the full human finger. Now, are either of these legit? Were they even really human remains? Who knows? Honestly, there's a really good chance that what these people were selling on Facebook isn't even real human remains. They could be touting it as human remains to tap into that audience, and the stuff could actually be made out of animal bones. I have no way to know. But for this little thought experiment that I want to take you on, let's operate under the assumption of a couple of different things. First, let's operate under the assumption that this jewelry or this home decor piece are actual human remains. And number two, let's operate under the assumption that somehow the remains in these items were legally procured and are legally being sold. So we'll take any sort of legal ramifications out of the equation. We're going to assume that it is what it is advertised as, and that legally speaking, everything is above board when we do our little thought experiment here. So when I first saw jewelry being made from human remains, my first thought was that has a very Ed Gein vibe to it, or Jeffrey Dahmer. But when I put that aside and really started to think about the topic, while it seems very macabre and a lot of people are instantly taken aback by that idea, a lot of people actually have human remains in their house. If you stop and think about it, a lot of people have cremated loved ones in their house or made into jewelry, etc. So there is a time and place where we socially consider it completely 100% acceptable to keep human remains not only in our house, but sometimes on our person too. So if we keep that in mind, then it's not quite so shock and awe. If we think about the fact that it actually can be socially acceptable and common practice to keep human remains in the forms of cremains or having cremains turned into things. But I have to admit, spoiler alert, I am not down for jewelry or home decor made out of human remains. And I, really went down a rabbit hole within myself in this, probably way more than I should have. But I thought about this enough that I'm doing a podcast episode on it. But I really started to think about this concept, right? And what the difference is for me as a spirit medium between keeping the cremains of a loved one and having a ring made out of a human femur. And there is a difference between the two as far as I'm concerned, or at least a potential difference. Now, if you followed me for a while, especially if you followed me back when I had the Spirit Tarot podcast on Podbean, then you've heard me talk about the fact that by and large, spirits don't remain attached to their body. The natural order of things is that when we pass, yes, our spirit does kind of linger around our body. There are some psychics and mediums who theorize or say that our souls can kind of hang around on here on Earth and around their body for up to about 72 hours after they've been laid to rest. And then by that point, most souls will complete the process of crossing over where we are intended to go after we pass. So there is that little window of time where the person who has passed, their soul might linger around their body just a little bit in that transitionary phase. Some spirits will definitely linger to see who shows up at their funeral, and things like that, and their viewing. So that's not uncommon. And it's not that they are an earthbound spirit at that point. It's just part of the process. Some people kind of linger for a little bit, or some souls, however you want to put it. But after that, generally speaking, in a lot of cases, our souls, our spirits, do not remain attached to the flesh bag that we were driving around in this lifetime. And I've talked about this when I talked about, cemeteries, about the fact that honestly, while there probably are a couple of haunted cemeteries throughout the US, that by and large, cemeteries aren't haunted. And I've talked about how our loved ones are not hanging around their gravesite on the regular, right? But if we want to communicate or talk to a departed loved one, we can go to their gravesite. And for a lot of people, that sort of acts as like a psychic trigger, and it helps them connect with the spirit of the departed loved one. But that is a trigger for the living person, not for the departed person. So sometimes, we go to the cemetery to talk to our departed loved one because it helps us to connect to them, but they don't need those remains. The spirit doesn't need those remains in order to communicate with us, the living. Hopefully that makes sense. So, in theory then, if our spirits don't tend to hang around our bodies after we've gone, then from a mediumship, spiritual, paranormal perspective, those remains should not bring any negative paranormal consequences. They shouldn't come with a spirit attached. But this really got me to thinking about the times when spirits do become attached to their remains. And a couple of the theories here are that if a person has a very traumatic death, they might become an earthbound spirit and they might remain attached to their physical remains. Another way is if they weren't properly buried, or if their remains are in some way mishandled. So in the case of the woman in Salem, Massachusetts who had the oddity shop, those remains were procured illegally. They also were mishandled, if you will, and those bodies were never properly buried. So the chances of the spirits of the people who initially owned those body parts could very well decide to make their displeasure known if you happen to own any of those pieces. And that partly depends on the person whose remains we're talking about, whether or not they would choose to become attached or choose to make their displeasure known. That's going to depend on who the person was/is in spirit form. Did they hold strong beliefs about how their body should be handled, about what should be done with their body, how their body should have been treated? If they didn't give a flying fig Newton, then chances are there's no energy, there's no spirit attached to those human remains. But if they were someone who had very strong beliefs and wishes when it came to those things, then they could opt to make their displeasure known to whomever is currently in possession of pieces of their remains. So as I thought about this femur ring or femur rings that this person was selling, I really was like, I love horror movies. I'm a fan of the macabre, obviously. If you know me, you know that. I would absolutely 100% have home decor that was replicas of human remains. Skeleton skulls. I have a couple of skulls that I have that are completely plastic, not real at all. I'm totally down for that aesthetic. But, and maybe it's just because I speak to the dead on a daily basis, but I personally, as I sat here and thought about it, and I was like, it's not so odd if you look at it in the context of we keep cremains of our loved ones around us. So just the idea of human remains alone, honestly, is not that bizarre. But, man, rings made out of human femurs. I personally would not be willing to make that gamble and take that risk of bringing that into my house, because you don't know, if it was legally procured. I find that a very risky chance to take, because from what I'm reading, honestly, it looks like any and all human remains being procured and sold today are illegally obtained. It doesn't really look like there's a legal way to obtain the remains. From what I'm reading, and I could be wrong, I'm not a legal expert and I don't know all about this, but that's kind of how it's looking from what I've been reading. Like, the actual dealing of the remains themselves is not what's illegal, it's the obtaining of the remains, and there really doesn't seem to be a legal way to get them. And I could be wrong about that, but from what I'm reading, it doesn't really look like there's a legal way to obtain them. From what I'm reading, it looks like probably if you're looking for human remains, which I don't advocate as we're getting into here, if you're looking for legal remains, from what I've been able to read and find, and again, I have not done a deep dive on this, if you're purchasing like antique Victorian, like medical models, the old skeletons that they used to have in the classrooms and that, those were real human skeletons that they had in their classrooms back in the day, the antiquity of medical school. And in most places in the United States, as I understand it, it is legal to buy and sell those, because they're antiques from the Victorian period and that. And I could be wrong. I have read stuff that says, yes, it's legal. No, it's not. It's very much a gray area. That may be the legal way to have remains. But consider this, okay? Back in that time period, how the medical schools got their cadavers and their remains for classes was they purchased them from grave robbers. While you might stand a better chance legally by purchasing like antique medical models, on the spiritual side of things, I really don't know that you're any safer. But again, for our thought experiment, let's say that you came across a human femur ring that was 100% legally obtained. It's 100% legal to buy and sell. Again, this is for the thought experiment. This is not reality, so don't go saying that Rin was like, hey, it's perfectly legal to have human remains. I'm not saying that. We're doing a thought experiment here, and in our thought experiment, in our little gray matter, these remains were obtained 100% legally, and it's 100% legal to buy and sell them. Okay, so we've taken that out of the equation for our thought experiment. What I want to know, or what I want to hear from you, is would you or would you not own and wear rings made out of human femurs? chances are, as I've said, because our spirits don't remain attached to our bodies, there's a good chance that it's not a haunted item, that the spirit is not pissed off and is not going to plague you and make their displeasure known. But are you personally willing to take that chance? Because I'll tell you, if a spirit is attached to that human femur ring because they are pissed that they were turned into a ring, that's not something that you can just banish or cleanse away, right? Like, you're not just doing a little smoke cleansing and, oh, it's gone, it's all good now. Like, that ain't happening. That's not realistic. If a spirit has attached to those pieces of themselves that they did not want turned into jewelry, you're not getting rid of that spirit easily. If at all. Because if we are being honest, there are spirits that we cannot banish. They have to decide to move on in their own, or have to be convinced in their own way. And if they are pissed that you are wearing their femur, they're not going to just go away because you ask them to. So as I personally thought about this, I was like, there is no way that I would have real human remains as home decor or as jewelry. And again, I'm talking about somebody that you didn't know. Cremains, I do consider different. And here's why. Cremains are, generally speaking, if we cremate somebody, that is what they wanted done with their remains. So we had their consent. And they were our loved ones. So we are keeping their remains with us to honor them, to respect their wishes. Even if we're turning it into like some jewelry and wearing it on us, right? It's out of love, respect, and reverence, and hopefully in accordance with that person's wishes. Hopefully we're not out here cremating people who didn't want to be cremated. So as a medium, there is a huge difference to me on a spiritual aspect. Because on a practical aspect, human remains are human remains. And, there are times where human remains being kept in the home or on the person are socially acceptable. But for me, the big thing is the spiritual difference, right? If we have our loved ones' cremains, we've had consent for that. They're at peace. We are honoring them. We are loving them. We are respecting them. Whereas if we are wearing someone's femur as a ring that we didn't know, and we're getting it from an oddity shop, it's a curiosity, it's a novelty, it's shock and awe, there's not a lot of love and respect in that. And we didn't know the person. We didn't have a connection to that person. So, it's understandable that a spirit might be like, yo, hold up. Why the fuck you wearing a piece of me? And then proceed to do increasingly negative things to get your attention, to try to tell you to fucking knock it off because they don't like it. And again, most spirits have already moved on. They don't give a flying fig Newton what people do with their remains. It's fine. But what about the spirits who do? So what about you? If you could know without a shadow of a doubt that the remains were obtained legally, that it's 100% legal to own the piece, buy the piece from someone, if it was, you knew it was all above board and there could be no legal repercussions, would you do it? Would you purchase and wear a ring or any other jewelry made out of human bones? I am not willing to take that risk. As I sat and contemplated all the different angles of this, I was like, you know what? No, that's where I draw the line. I would buy haunted dolls before I would buy human remains to keep on my person or in my house. I really and truly would, 100%. Because most of the dolls that are supposedly haunted are not actually haunted. I think that honestly, between the two, and again, I have not, like, there's never been a study on this. I have not purchased any of these items. So, theoretically speaking, my theory, my hypothesis is that you'd be more likely to get negative spiritual consequences from buying and wearing or using human remains as home decor than you would getting a doll that is actually haunted. Again, that's just conjecture on my part based on my personal and professional experiences. I feel like between the two options, I'm more likely to get a negative spirit encounter out of human remains than I am a haunted, quotes, air quotes, a haunted doll off of eBay. Which in the end means that human remains are a hard pass for me personally. But I want to know what all of you think. Do you think that as long as, again, for our thought experiment, the remains are 100% legally obtained, no legal ramifications can happen to you? If that was the case, would you purchase and display and or wear human remains in your home, on your person? Would you worry about, paranormal activity? What would you do to try to lessen that or deal with any paranormal activity that came out of having these objects? Is it a hard pass for you too? Why is it a hard pass for you? Because different people may have different reasons for this being a hard pass. And other people may have, reasons for why they think that it would be a fabulous idea to own these things. Either way, whichever side of the fence you're on, feel free to leave your opinions and your feelings on the topic in the comments below, because I'd love to hear from you. Would you or would you not be into these items? Like I said, for me, just from my personal experiences, it's a hard pass for me. But not everybody has had the same experiences that I have had. So let me know what your thoughts and ideas and feelings on this topic are. If you've enjoyed this little thought experiment, give the video a thumbs up, please. If you haven't already, please subscribe. And until I see you again, stay creepy.